What would you do if your own brother betrayed everything you grew up believing in? That question has haunted the corridors of Buckingham Palace for weeks. It's not a hypothetical. It's not a scenario dreamed up for tabloids. It's real. Prince William, the heir apparent to the British throne, has discovered a series of events that have left him stunned, furious, and questioning how much of his family he can trust. And at the center of it all, Prince Harry and Meghan Markle, whose latest venture has sent shockwaves through the royal household and across the globe. It began innocuously, or so it seemed. A press release quietly slipped to deadline about a new documentary titled Cookie Queens, set to premiere in 2026. On the surface, it was a harmless, even charming story. A coming-of-age tale centered around the joys, pressures, and emotional roller coaster of Girl Scout cookie season in America. Executive producers? None other than the Duke and Duchess of Sussex. And that, as William quickly realized, was the problem. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. At first glance, who would suspect that a film about cookies could ignite a royal storm? But William saw through it instantly. This wasn't just a feel-good documentary. Beneath the sugary veneer, there was a potential blueprint, a subtle way for Harry and Meghan to weaponize their insider access, to share intimate stories from within the monarchy, and to profit from them. They weren't merely telling a story about cookies. They were crafting a narrative that could expose the royal family in ways never seen before. And William knew that if he didn't act, the consequences would be catastrophic. But why now? That was the question haunting him. After Megxit, after interviews, after the constant media attention surrounding Harry and Meghan's choices, it seemed the royal family had exhausted every possible measure to contain the fallout. Yet here they were, seemingly innocuous in appearance, quietly plotting another move, this time under the guise of Girl Scouts and cookie boxes. The audacity was almost breathtaking. William's mind raced as he pieced together the implications. Every public appearance, every interview Harry had given, every social media post Meghan had carefully curated, it was all part of a larger picture. And now, with Cookie Queens, the stakes were higher than ever. This was more than public embarrassment. This could be a strategic undermining of the monarchy itself. The thought made William's jaw tighten. He had always protected his family, endured public scrutiny, and maintained composure under intense pressure. But this felt different. This felt like a personal attack. And then came the leaks. Whispered rumors began circulating among palace aides and trusted advisors. Some footage had already been reviewed, and while it seemed harmless to outsiders, those with insider knowledge, like William, saw the thinly veiled opportunities for secrets to slip, for narratives to twist against the family. It wasn't just the potential betrayal that stung, it was the sheer planning, the calculated approach. Harry and Meghan weren't improvising. This was deliberate. Imagine, for a moment, standing in William's shoes. Every move you make is under scrutiny. Every decision carries weight far beyond personal consequence. Yet here is your brother, someone you trusted implicitly, preparing to launch a project that could redefine the monarchy in ways that you cannot control. It's not just anger. It's betrayal on a scale that shakes the very foundation of what you thought you knew about family loyalty. As William summoned advisors, there was tension in the air thicker than fog on the Thames. Emergency meetings were called. Discussions that had been theoretical suddenly became urgent. Legal experts, communications teams, and senior palace staff were brought in to dissect every angle of Cookie Queens. How could this documentary be contained? How could its narrative be anticipated? How could the public's perception be controlled before the Sussex's vision was broadcast worldwide? These were questions that needed answers, and the clock was ticking. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, Harry and Meghan were moving forward with their project, unaware, or perhaps indifferent, to the storm they were about to unleash. Their team of writers, producers, and media consultants were treating it as a creative venture. To the world, Cookie Queens was wholesome, inspiring, and relatable. But for those in the know, every scene, every scripted moment, carried potential ramifications for the royal family. And William, ever the protector of tradition and image, could not stand idly by. Public opinion was another battlefield entirely. The monarchy had always relied on a carefully managed image, duty, decorum, and the quiet sacrifices of generations. Harry and Meghan had, in the past, disrupted this balance with their interviews and media ventures. But this time, the stakes were more subtle, more insidious. A seemingly innocent project about American cookies could, if mishandled or exploited, expose personal vulnerabilities, ignite criticism, and damage the public's perception of the royal institution. And yet, amidst the tension, there was an almost surreal irony. Here was a couple who had been criticized for leaving royal duties, yet now they were taking on the role of storytellers, documenting seemingly trivial aspects of American youth culture while potentially weaponizing it against the family they had left behind. The contrast was almost laughable if it weren't so serious. It was a moment that blended the absurd with the catastrophic, and it was precisely the moment William had been bracing for. William's reflections weren't limited to strategy. Emotionally, the discovery cut deep. This was his brother, someone he had shared childhood memories, holidays, and family traditions with, someone he had relied on, confided in, and protected. To see that trust manipulated for personal or public gain was jarring. And yet, William had a role to play that transcended personal grievances. He was not just protecting himself. He was protecting an institution, a legacy, and millions of people who revered the monarchy. The question then became, what action could be taken? How do you respond when a member of your own family appears poised to exploit intimacy and trust for personal gain? It required precision, patience, and a strategy that balanced firmness with discretion. And for William, the path forward was clear. Decisive intervention was necessary. He could not allow cookie queens to become a vehicle for betrayal, no matter how cleverly disguised beneath the innocent pretense of cookies and coming-of-age storytelling. As advisors prepared reports, William reviewed past missteps and calculated potential future risks. The palace had learned lessons from previous media engagements, and now all of that knowledge was being applied in real time. Every possible scenario was being considered. Public backlash, international media scrutiny, social media amplification, and the inevitable questions that would arise when the documentary premiered. And yet, despite all this planning, one truth remained. The emotional stakes were as high as the strategic ones. William knew that confronting Harry directly was risky. A family confrontation could escalate tensions, generate unwanted publicity, and risk irreparable damage. But waiting, watching, and allowing the project to proceed unchecked was even riskier. This was a delicate balancing act, acting with authority without appearing vindictive, protecting the monarchy without alienating the public, and defending tradition without stifling creativity. And so, as the days passed, William's resolve solidified. He would take action. He would ensure that the royal family's dignity was preserved. And he would do so while maintaining the subtlety and discretion demanded by centuries of protocol. But even as he prepared, he could not ignore the personal turmoil this caused. Watching your own brother and sister-in-law, who were supposed to be allies, move in ways that threatened family, legacy, and trust, that was a kind of heartbreak that few could understand. The public had yet to see what was brewing behind palace doors. To them, Harry and Meghan were merely embarking on a creative venture. But the truth, as William knew, was far more complex. The layers of intent, ambition, and potential betrayal were woven into every detail of Cookie Queens. And while the documentary might appear innocuous on the surface, the stakes were monumental. Imagine the tension in Buckingham Palace during these days. Advisors whispering in hallways, security briefings heightened, and late-night strategy sessions where every word, every possible leak, was analyzed. William was not just planning a response. He was orchestrating a defense of an institution, a legacy, and a family. And yet, he understood that public opinion, media narratives, and Harry and Meghan's own cunning could turn even the most meticulous plan on its head. And then came the first glimpse of actual footage. Even in its early, unpolished form, the potential for exposure was clear. Innocuous conversations, snippets of family anecdotes, and subtle references could, if misrepresented, paint the royal family in a negative light. It was a carefully constructed puzzle, and William saw the pieces falling into place. He realized that inaction was not an option. Every delay, every hesitation, could magnify the impact when Cookie Queens finally premiered. And so, with a heavy heart but unwavering determination, William began the process that would ultimately reshape the dynamic between him and Harry, between the royal family and the public, and perhaps between the monarchy and history itself. He would take steps that were both calculated and emotional, strategic and personal. Actions that, once taken, could not be undone. But even as plans solidified, one question lingered in William's mind. How far were Harry and Meghan willing to go? How much of their own ambition would they risk for visibility, for control, for influence? And most importantly, would there come a moment when even their own family could no longer stand by silently? The answer, as William soon discovered, was coming. And when it did, it would spark a confrontation that no one in the royal family, or the world, would forget. What happens when the people you trust most turn against you? That's the question haunting the halls of Buckingham Palace right now. And at the center of it all stands Prince William, staring down a storm he never thought he would face. His own brother, Prince Harry, and Meghan Markle. The tension isn't just political. It's personal. It's raw. It's the kind of family betrayal that goes beyond tabloids, beyond gossip, and hits at the very core of loyalty, blood, and legacy. It began subtly, almost imperceptibly, but William noticed it immediately. Small shifts in tone during conversations, discreet leaks in the media, and strategic PR moves that, on the surface, appeared innocuous, all pointed towards something much bigger, something deliberate. Cookie Queens wasn't just a documentary about Girl Scout cookies. William understood instinctively that the Sussexes were using it as a vessel, a Trojan horse, to further their own narrative, to shape public perception, and possibly, to expose secrets the family had long guarded behind palace walls. Think about that for a moment. A seemingly harmless story about cookie sales, childhood lessons, and coming-of-age struggles. A story almost every American family could relate to, being used as a weapon against centuries of tradition. That's audacity of a level most people couldn't even imagine. Yet, to William, the danger was crystal clear. This wasn't just media attention or celebrity drama. This was an attack, and it required immediate action. The palace staff had been uneasy for weeks, sensing tension rise, but not fully grasping the scale of what was unfolding. Meetings that had once been procedural now took on a different urgency. Advisors who had prepared media strategies and public relations responses for every conceivable royal scandal suddenly realized that Cookie Queens might represent an entirely new kind of threat, not one easily deflected with statements or appearances. This was strategy, planning, and calculated exposure. William called in trusted aides. He summoned legal experts. He reviewed every previous media appearance, every interview Harry and Meghan had given since their departure from royal duties. Patterns emerged: repetition in phrasing, subtle digs, carefully framed anecdotes, hints of information that could be misinterpreted by the public if presented out of context. Every detail, every nuance mattered. And with Cookie Queens, the stakes were unprecedented. To understand William's position, imagine standing in his shoes. Everything you do, every decision, every word, is under intense public scrutiny. Millions of eyes are watching. Every misstep could be amplified. And yet, here is your own brother, seemingly trusted, seemingly loved, preparing to engage in a project that could undermine your family, your legacy, and the institution you are sworn to protect. It's a unique kind of betrayal, one that blends personal hurt with public responsibility. As William grappled with the implications, he also had to consider the international attention this would attract. Media from the United Kingdom to the United States were already circling, sniffing for any detail, any hint, any scoop they could publish. Social media platforms buzzed with speculation, hashtags trending before anyone could verify facts, and opinion pieces poised to frame the story before the Sussexes even went public. The world was watching, waiting for a narrative to latch onto. And William realized he couldn't afford to let the first narrative come from Harry and Meghan. It wasn't just the media that concerned him. It was the emotional fallout. This was family. These were the people he had grown up with, shared holidays with, confided in, and protected. To watch them maneuver in ways that risked public humiliation, media sensationalism, and the distortion of truth, it was almost unbearable. And yet, William knew he had to set aside personal feelings to protect something far larger, the monarchy itself. Palace corridors buzzed with whispered conversations. Security briefings were heightened. Advisors discussed potential scenarios that ranged from manageable public curiosity to catastrophic media exposure. Every possible angle was examined. Could Cookie Queens be edited to minimize sensitive content? Could pre-release reviews prevent leaks? Could a counter-narrative be established in advance to protect the family's reputation? These were the questions that dominated the palace's strategy sessions. Meanwhile, Harry and Meghan were seemingly moving forward with a sense of calm confidence, unaware, or perhaps indifferent, to the full scope of the storm they were triggering. Their team treated the project as a creative endeavor, something that would entertain audiences and perhaps even inspire them. But William saw a different picture. He saw a potential minefield. Each anecdote, each intimate moment, each offhand remark could be extracted, misrepresented, and magnified into something that could damage the family's public image and, by extension, the monarchy itself. The irony was striking. Here was a couple criticized for leaving royal duties, now wielding storytelling as a tool, potentially undermining the institution they had departed. On one hand, it was almost laughable. The idea that a story about cookies could be so dangerous. On the other, the seriousness of the threat was undeniable. For William, it was a constant tension between absurdity and catastrophe, between public perception and private reality. William's personal feelings were complicated. He was hurt, yes, but he was also strategic. He had to think several moves ahead. Confronting Harry directly could escalate tensions, generate unwanted publicity, and risk long-term family damage. Waiting, however, could allow the project to gain traction, embedding sensitive content that would be difficult to manage once it reached the public. He needed a plan that balanced firmness with diplomacy, authority with discretion, and he needed it fast. As he reviewed early footage of Cookie Queens, even in its rough form, William's instincts were validated. The potential for exposure was real. Innocuous conversations, offhand anecdotes, glimpses into family dynamics. Everything was a potential vulnerability, and Harry, ever the media-savvy prince, understood the power of framing. He knew how to present information in ways that could captivate audiences while subtly undermining the family narrative. The palace had been here before, in a sense, during past media crises, but this was different. This wasn't just a PR challenge or an interview gone wrong. This was a carefully orchestrated media endeavor with layers of potential consequences. And William, aware of the stakes, knew that inaction was not an option. The reputation of the monarchy, the integrity of the institution, and the trust of millions of people hung in the balance. William's advisors worked tirelessly, examining every possible outcome. What if the documentary were interpreted as exposing royal secrets? What if the media sensationalized harmless anecdotes? What if public perception shifted, questioning the relevance and integrity of the monarchy? Each scenario required contingency planning, proactive media responses, and meticulous attention to detail. The margin for error was minimal, and the consequences of failure could be historic. And yet, amidst all this strategic planning, William's emotional turmoil was undeniable. Watching his brother and sister-in-law maneuver in ways that threatened not just him, but the family legacy was a personal blow. It was a blend of anger, sadness, and disbelief. How could someone so close, someone raised in the same family, act in a manner so calculated and detached from the consequences for those left behind? The public had no idea what was brewing. To them, Cookie Queens was a creative, wholesome documentary about childhood and cookies. To William, it was a test of loyalty, a potential threat to centuries of tradition, and a challenge to everything the monarchy stood for. The contrast between perception and reality was stark, almost surreal. Yet, for William, clarity was crucial. Understanding the full scope of the threat was the first step toward countering it effectively. And as he contemplated the next steps, one truth became clear. This wasn't just about media. It was about trust. It was about family. It was about legacy. William had to act decisively, balancing personal feelings with public responsibility, navigating a web of strategic, emotional, and ethical considerations that could define the monarchy's future. But even as plans were being laid, one nagging question remained. How far would Harry and Meghan go? How much of their ambition, their desire for influence, their need for public validation, would they risk before recognizing the damage they were causing? And most importantly, could William stop them before it was too late? The answer, as William would soon discover, was more complicated than he imagined. And when the first real confrontation occurred, the consequences would reverberate through the palace, the media, and the world in ways no one could have predicted. What if the sweetest story you ever heard was actually a disguise for something far darker? That's the reality that Prince William faced when he realized the true nature of Harry and Meghan's new venture. To understand the gravity of the situation, we need to step inside Harry and Meghan's world. After Megxit, the couple had cultivated an image of independence, creativity, and empowerment. They were the modern royal rebels, unshackled from palace protocol, free to forge their own path. But with freedom came opportunity. Opportunity to influence public perception, to profit from their insider access, and, some would argue, to subtly challenge the institution they left behind. Cookie Queens was the perfect vehicle. At first glance, the idea seems almost absurd. How could a documentary about cookies threaten centuries of tradition and the legacy of the monarchy? But William saw through the veneer immediately. It wasn't the cookies themselves, it was the access, the narrative framing, and the subtle ability to insert personal anecdotes into a story that millions would watch. Every joke, every reflection on childhood, every subtle mention of family dynamics could, if interpreted strategically, shape public opinion. William's realization was chilling. Harry and Meghan weren't just telling a story. They were crafting a narrative where the royal family could be humanized, scrutinized, and subtly criticized all at once. They understood the power of media. They knew how to frame moments to evoke empathy, highlight contradictions, and position themselves as both victims and heroes. And with Cookie Queens, the stakes were higher than ever. The project had a veneer of innocence, but William recognized its potential to function as a soft exposé, a way to broadcast their perspective to millions while maintaining plausible deniability. Consider the mechanics of their strategy. By centering the documentary around Girl Scout cookies, a seemingly innocuous, universally recognized symbol, they created a perfect camouflage. The focus on a wholesome, relatable activity disguised the deeper messaging. Anecdotes about teamwork, childhood challenges, and entrepreneurial spirit were intertwined with subtle commentary on family, privilege, and personal growth. It was storytelling mastery. Every emotional beat meticulously crafted to resonate with audiences while keeping the source material just ambiguous enough to avoid immediate scrutiny. William's advisors quickly realized that this wasn't just a media concern, it was a strategic family crisis. If Harry and Meghan succeeded in framing the narrative their way, they could influence public perception of the royal family, redefine the story of Megxit, and potentially open the door to further projects that might reveal sensitive information. Every decision, every pause, every delayed response from the palace risked allowing the narrative to take root. And yet, there was another layer, an emotional one. For William, watching his brother orchestrate this kind of operation was a personal blow. Harry had once been a confidant, a protector, someone he could rely on in moments of both joy and crisis. But now, it seemed that bond had been compromised by ambition and the allure of public influence. Meghan, with her media savvy and relentless drive, had become the catalyst. Together, they represented a unified front, a duo moving with precision, intent, and an almost frightening clarity of purpose. It wasn't difficult to trace the pattern of planning. Over the past months, Harry had cultivated relationships with top producers, journalists, and content strategists, ensuring that every angle was considered. Meghan had consulted with PR specialists, narrative designers, and social media analysts to maximize reach and impact. Their combined effort was methodical, professional, and designed to achieve exactly what they wanted: influence, attention, and the ability to shape the story on their terms. What made it even more striking was how carefully they managed their public image. Interviews and appearances were curated to maintain the perception of innocence. Cookie Queens was presented as a lighthearted, feel-good story, emphasizing growth, friendship, and perseverance. The message to the audience was clear. This is a couple who cared deeply about community, youth empowerment, and social impact. But William knew the undercurrents. The narrative's subtle complexity, when dissected by those with insider knowledge, could reveal another layer entirely. A commentary on privilege, responsibility, and perhaps even an indirect critique of the royal family itself. At Buckingham Palace, every advisor and aide was acutely aware of the potential implications. Legal teams debated the limits of privacy, intellectual property, and defamation. Communications staff drafted statements, tested responses, and modeled scenarios for both public and social media reactions. Security teams evaluated potential risks if private anecdotes or palace-related stories were unintentionally included. The palace was operating at full alert, knowing that even a small slip could be magnified by international media coverage. And yet, despite the seriousness of the situation, Harry and Meghan appeared calm, confident, untouched by the undercurrents they were stirring. To them, this was simply the next step in a post-royal career, a creative, entrepreneurial endeavor designed to inspire audiences and expand their influence. But William knew the reality. This was no ordinary project. It was a carefully calibrated strategy, and he was determined to counter it. The emotional stakes were impossible to ignore. William felt betrayed, not only as a prince, but as a brother. This was family. A bond that had been forged through shared childhood experiences, mutual support, and loyalty. And yet, here was Harry, acting in a way that prioritized ambition and public perception over trust and familial respect. It wasn't just a matter of policy or image, it was personal. And William's response would need to reflect both dimensions, strategic precision and emotional reckoning. To make matters more complex, Meghan's role in all of this was undeniable. Her influence over Harry had been a subject of speculation for years, and here, it was crystal clear. She was not merely a participant, she was a driving force. Every production decision, every narrative choice, every framing of a scene could be traced back to her strategic vision. William realized that to address the threat effectively, he would need to account for both Harry's familial loyalty and Meghan's media acumen. William began to map out the potential consequences in painstaking detail. What if the documentary gained critical acclaim before the palace could respond? What if subtle revelations were misinterpreted, framing the family in a negative light? What if the public began to question the integrity of the monarchy based on anecdotes presented as innocent storytelling? Every possibility was considered, debated, and prepared for. And yet, the unpredictability of human behavior meant that no plan could guarantee complete control. At the same time, William understood that public perception was fluid. While cookie queens appeared innocuous, the palace needed to anticipate how journalists, social media influencers, and international media outlets might interpret even minor details. They needed contingency plans for potential misrepresentations, leaks, or misquotes. Every communication would need to be precise, deliberate, and timely. And so, as the days turned into weeks, William's awareness of the Sussexes' agenda deepened. He recognized that Cookie Queens was more than a creative project. It was a calculated move with layers of intent, designed to achieve specific outcomes. And he also recognized that inaction was not an option. To protect the monarchy, preserve the family's reputation, and maintain control over the narrative, decisive action would be required. Yet even as William prepared, one question gnawed at him relentlessly. How far were Harry and Meghan willing to go? Ambition, influence, and media mastery could drive extraordinary success, but at what cost? Could a family survive such calculated moves? Or would this mark a turning point from which relationships could never recover? The answer was approaching faster than William anticipated. And when the first concrete evidence of Harry and Meghan's intentions became undeniable, it would spark a confrontation that threatened to reshape not just the royal household, but the very story the world thought it knew about them. What happens when the brother you grew up with, the person you shared childhood secrets with, the one you trusted implicitly, begins acting in ways that feel like betrayal? That was the moment Prince William experienced when he first glimpsed the deeper reality of Harry and Meghan's Cookie Queens project. On the surface, it was harmless, a documentary about cookies, childhood, and coming-of-age stories. But William, who had been watching quietly, connecting dots, and listening to whispered rumors in the palace, knew immediately that the project held far more than sugary innocence. It was a Trojan horse, and he had just discovered the trap. It started with a file arriving discreetly on his desk. Rough cuts of scenes, script notes, and planning documents had been quietly circulated to a select few, ostensibly for family review and feedback. But the documents weren't benign. Hidden within seemingly innocent segments were subtle references to family traditions, anecdotes from childhood, and moments that, if taken out of context, could paint the royal family in an unflattering light. William's eyes scanned the pages with disbelief. Every smile, every reflection, every small scene seemed layered with potential for misrepresentation. William's pulse quickened. He understood the power of narrative better than anyone. A single line, a carefully framed anecdote, or a fleeting glance on film could be interpreted millions of ways. And here was his own brother, participating willingly, guided by Meghan's strategic vision, carefully constructing moments that could be interpreted as exposing the family while keeping plausible deniability. The audacity was staggering. He called in his advisors immediately. The room, usually calm, was now charged with tension. Legal experts, communication specialists, and palace aides gathered, each examining the materials with growing concern. What seemed innocent to the public was anything but. There were scenes that could suggest tension, criticism, or personal anecdotes about royal life. Innocuous dialogue about tradition could be framed as critique. A casual remark about family expectations could be amplified into a media sensation. William felt the weight of it all pressing down. The potential impact on the monarchy, on his parents, on the perception of the royal family worldwide. And yet, the most piercing element wasn't the strategic risk, it was the emotional sting. This wasn't a corporate rival, a media conglomerate, or an anonymous critic. This was Harry, his brother. Someone he had shared secrets with, played games with, and confided in. Someone he had defended in the public eye countless times. And now, that same person was participating in a project that could, intentionally or not, undermine the very family he had sworn to protect. William's mind raced through the implications. Every public appearance, every past interview, every story about childhood or family dynamics could suddenly take on new significance. And when Cookie Queens finally premiered, the world would see the narrative Harry and Meghan had constructed, a narrative carefully designed to elicit empathy, admiration, and attention, all while subtly reshaping the public's understanding of the monarchy. He remembered the moment it all clicked. The specific scene that made him realize this wasn't accidental. A seemingly trivial exchange about teamwork and leadership in Girl Scouts mirrored past conflicts and experiences within the family. On its own, the scene was innocent. But when placed in context, it became a mirror, reflecting private family dynamics to a global audience. It was clever, subtle, and calculated, and William felt a surge of anger that was difficult to contain. The advisors spoke in hushed tones, analyzing the potential fallout. If this segment is interpreted as a critique of royal authority, one whispered, it could spark public debate questioning the monarchy's relevance. Another added, even if Harry frames it as a personal story, the media will extract context and run with it. William listened silently, his jaw tightening. The room was filled with tension, anticipation, and a shared sense of urgency. Something had to be done, and quickly. But it wasn't just strategy, it was a test of family loyalty. William realized that this discovery meant more than protecting image. It was about confronting betrayal. Could he reach Harry directly, or would that escalate tensions? How could he act without making the family appear divided in public? Every move had to be deliberate, every response measured. There was no room for impulsive decisions. At the same time, William reflected on Meghan's role. She was a master strategist, media savvy, and remarkably disciplined in shaping public perception. Her influence over Harry was undeniable, and her ability to guide the narrative, control framing, and anticipate public reaction was what made the project so dangerous. She wasn't just a participant, she was a mastermind. And William knew that to counter this effectively, he would need to consider both her influence and Harry's involvement. As he pored over the materials, the picture became clearer. Cookie Queens was not simply a story about childhood or cookies. It was a calculated vehicle to project influence, craft public perception, and subtly shape the narrative of the royal family from a position outside the institution. Every scene, Every line, every subtle gesture could be leveraged for maximum impact. And if left unchecked, the consequences could be significant. A reshaped public image, a questioning of royal authority, and the emergence of a narrative controlled entirely by those who had departed the family fold. William's advisors were clear. A response had to be swift, precise, and multifaceted. Legal teams needed to review intellectual property, potential privacy violations, and the limits of confidentiality. Communications specialists had to develop proactive statements, anticipating media reactions before the project went public. Public perception had to be managed with precision, ensuring that the monarchy remained above controversy while addressing potential misinterpretations. Every possible angle was dissected, debated, and planned for. And yet, despite the seriousness of the situation, William couldn't ignore the personal betrayal. Watching Harry and Meghan execute this plan with confidence, composure, and apparent disregard for familial trust was a personal blow. This wasn't just about media or public perception. It was about loyalty, integrity, and the bonds that had defined their relationship since childhood. William thought back to their early years, shared holidays, playful arguments, and the deep sense of trust that had always existed between brothers. To see that trust potentially exploited was a bitter pill. And yet, he knew that emotional responses could not dictate strategy. Protecting the monarchy required focus, clarity, and a willingness to act decisively, regardless of personal feelings. Hours turned into days as the team analyzed every segment, every scene, every script note. Patterns emerged. Moments that had been harmless in the editing room suddenly carried weight when contextualized against past family experiences. Anecdotes about tradition became potential critiques. Observations about leadership were reframed as commentary on royal authority. And William realized that this project, while framed as a harmless story, had the power to subtly reshape public perception in ways that could not be reversed. He also understood the broader implications. Cookie queens could set a precedent, showing that private family experiences could be leveraged for public influence, even by those who had left the institution. It was a turning point, not just for the monarchy, but for the relationship between personal narrative and public perception. And for William, it was a clear signal. Action had to be taken. As he reviewed the final documents, William's resolve hardened. He would act, but carefully. Confrontation alone would not suffice. He needed strategy, precision, and timing. Legal avenues had to be explored. Communications had to be managed. And every potential leak, misinterpretation, or misrepresentation had to be anticipated and mitigated. Failure was not an option. And yet, one lingering question haunted him. How far were Harry and Meghan willing to go? Was this project simply about influence and public attention, or was it a step in a larger plan, one that could fundamentally alter the monarchy, family dynamics, and public perception? Only time would reveal the answer. Imagine hearing that a simple story about cookies and childhood could ignite a royal storm the likes of which Britain hasn't seen in decades. That's exactly what happened when the full scope of Harry and Meghan's Cookie Queens documentary became clear. What started as a seemingly innocent project, a heartwarming tale of Girl Scouts navigating friendship, entrepreneurship, and life lessons, quickly transformed into a potential weapon capable of reshaping the royal family's public image and sending shockwaves through Buckingham Palace. The first official press release from Deadline framed it as lighthearted and wholesome. A coming-of-age story about the joys, pressures, and pain points woven into one of America's most cherished rituals, Girl Scout cookie season. On paper, it sounded harmless, even inspiring. But behind the words, William, along with palace advisors, recognized a subtler, more dangerous undertone. This wasn't just a documentary about cookies. It was an avenue for Harry and Meghan to craft a narrative that could highlight their experiences, draw empathy, and subtly critique the institution they had left. William knew the risks immediately. The Sussexes had mastered the art of storytelling. Every anecdote, every carefully constructed scene, and every interview segment could be manipulated to influence public perception. And Cookie Queens, with its innocent lens, was the perfect disguise. The average viewer would see only the charming, wholesome story. But those But the real bombshell came when advisors discovered subtle references to royal life embedded within seemingly innocuous scenes. A discussion about responsibility within a Girl Scout troop mirrored leadership challenges within the monarchy. A casual story about team disputes echoed past familial disagreements. William read the script notes and paused at several moments, recognizing the potential for misrepresentation. Even a fleeting line about expectations or tradition could, if reframed by media outlets, be interpreted as criticism of royal authority. William felt a mixture of anger and disbelief. His brother, someone he had trusted with his deepest fears and joys, was participating in a project that could, intentionally or not, undermine the institution they both belonged to. And Meghan, ever strategic, had orchestrated much of the narrative flow, ensuring that each segment maximized emotional resonance while subtly shaping public perception. It was precise, calculated, and devastatingly effective. The palace's reaction was immediate and intense. Emergency meetings were convened. Security protocols were heightened. Legal teams began drafting strategies to mitigate potential exposure. Communications departments mapped out media responses, identifying journalists and outlets that could amplify misinterpretations. Every possible scenario was considered, from minor public curiosity to full-blown media frenzy, questioning the monarchy's credibility. The stakes were enormous, and the pressure on William was unrelenting. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, Harry and Meghan continued their work, apparently unaware or deliberately unconcerned about the chaos their project had created. Their team of producers and consultants approached Cookie Queens as a creative endeavor, focused on storytelling, aesthetics, and public appeal. They framed it as a tale of inspiration, empowerment, and community engagement. But William, seeing the layers beneath, understood that their choices were not random. They were strategic. Every interview, every visual, every anecdote was a potential lever of influence, carefully calibrated to achieve maximum impact. The emotional component of the discovery weighed heavily on William. Watching his brother and sister-in-law execute a plan that, if misinterpreted, could embarrass, destabilize, or even challenge the monarchy, was deeply personal. This was more than a media strategy. It was a direct test of loyalty, trust, and family bonds. And William, tasked with protecting not only his family, but also the institution and the millions of people who revered it, felt the pressure mounting with each passing hour. The advisors, understanding the delicate nature of the situation, emphasized caution. "We need to prepare for every possible interpretation," one whispered. "Even if the Sussexes' intentions are innocent, the public will read into it what they want." Another added, "This isn't just about content, it's about context. Every frame has meaning." William nodded, internalizing the gravity of every word. The royal family's legacy was on the line, and any misstep could have far-reaching consequences. And yet, amidst the strategy and planning, William couldn't ignore the personal sense of betrayal. Cookie Queens wasn't just a professional threat, it was a deeply personal affront. Harry was his brother, someone he had trusted implicitly. Meghan, with her influence, had elevated the project from a simple documentary to a calculated media operation. The combination of familial betrayal and strategic threat was a storm William had not anticipated when Cookie Queens was first announced. The stakes were further complicated by public perception. To the world, Cookie Queens appeared innocent, charming, and relatable. Millions of viewers would see only the cheerful smiles, the cookie boxes, and the heartwarming narrative. But the reality, known only to William and palace insiders, was far more complex. Beneath the surface lay layers of potential exposure, subtle critique, and narrative control that could subtly reshape how the public viewed the royal family. As William reviewed more materials, he realized the extent of the planning. The documentary had been meticulously crafted to resonate with audiences on multiple levels: emotional, cultural, and personal. Each scene was designed to evoke empathy, while subtly introducing narratives that could influence public perception of the monarchy. This was no accident. It was a masterclass in media strategy and a direct challenge to the authority, reputation, and image of the royal family. William's response had to be equally strategic. Confrontation, while tempting, could backfire and generate unwanted media attention. Silence, on the other hand, risked allowing the narrative to take hold unchecked. He needed a plan that addressed both the emotional betrayal and the strategic threat. Every action, every decision, every statement had to be precise, measured, and deliberate. And then came the realization that shook him even further. Cookie Queens wasn't just a one-off project. It was part of a broader agenda, a long-term plan to leverage media, storytelling, and public influence. Harry and Meghan were building platforms, shaping narratives, and strategically positioning themselves in ways that could have enduring implications for the monarchy, the public, and their own family. William understood the magnitude of what was unfolding. This wasn't just about cookies. This wasn't just about media exposure. This was about loyalty, strategy, and the delicate balance between family, legacy, and public perception. And as he prepared to take action, he knew one thing with absolute clarity. The confrontation that lay ahead would not only test his resolve, but also determine the future of the royal family's narrative in a world increasingly dominated by media influence. When a storm is coming, some see it. Others feel the first gusts and hope it passes. For Buckingham Palace, the storm wasn't a metaphor. It was real, and it had a name: Cookie Queens. The discovery of Harry and Meghan's documentary, which on the surface seemed innocuous, ignited a flurry of panic, strategy, and unrelenting activity inside the palace walls. Every advisor, aide, and staff member understood that this was no ordinary media project. It was a potential crisis capable of shaking the foundations of the monarchy, testing loyalties, and reshaping public perception in ways that could not be reversed. It began with the emergency meetings. In conference rooms bathed in soft fluorescent light, palace aides shuffled papers, laptops glowed with rough cuts of the documentary, and the hum of quiet conversations filled the air. Advisors debated legal frameworks, communication strategies, and potential media fallout. Every scenario had to be anticipated, every risk evaluated, and every statement crafted with precision. Even the slightest misstep could give the narrative an advantage, allowing Harry and Meghan to control the story before the palace could respond. William, at the center of it all, felt the tension in his chest tighten. This wasn't just about protecting the family image. It was about preempting a calculated media maneuver from his own brother and sister-in-law. Every moment they delayed could allow the Sussexes' narrative to take hold. He leaned over the table, reviewing rough scripts and early cuts, noting subtle nuances, and mentally cataloging every potential vulnerability. The stakes were monumental, not just the monarchy's reputation, but the trust, cohesion, and future stability of the royal family itself. The legal team spoke first. They outlined potential avenues to limit exposure: intellectual property rights, privacy concerns, and potential misrepresentation claims. But the challenge was immense. Cookie Queens had been carefully designed to appear harmless, masking its deeper layers. On the surface, there was nothing actionable. Beneath it, the implications were significant, but legally, proving intent or harm was complicated. The team looked at William with a mix of concern and urgency. "This isn't straightforward," one advisor cautioned. "We're navigating a minefield of media law and family loyalty." Meanwhile, communication strategists were crafting contingencies. They identified journalists and media outlets most likely to amplify sensitive content, developed messaging frameworks, and brainstormed proactive narratives to mitigate potential public backlash. Social media simulations were run, predicting audience reactions and engagement levels. Every what-if scenario was modeled: a leaked anecdote, a misunderstood scene, or a viral clip that could distort perception. William listened intently, absorbing each risk and mentally preparing the next moves. Security teams were equally vigilant. They examined the flow of information, tracing who had access to the documentary's content, and monitored for potential leaks. The palace had always been a fortress, both physically and informationally, but Cookie Queens introduced a new type of threat: narrative infiltration. Information didn't have to be stolen. It could be subtly reframed, shared selectively, and amplified through global media. This was influence as a weapon, and the palace had to respond accordingly. In the midst of the scramble, William confronted another reality. This was deeply personal. Every strategic consideration was intertwined with emotional stakes. Harry was his brother, Meghan his sister-in-law, and yet, the choices they were making now threatened not just public perception, but familial bonds. Every discussion, every analysis, and every decision in those rooms carried a dual weight. One of strategy, the other of heartbreak. The palace staff worked tirelessly, often late into the night. Advisors cross-referenced documents, flagged potential vulnerabilities, and rehearsed possible responses. Legal teams debated the merits of preemptive actions, while communications specialists drafted statements that could be deployed at a moment's notice. Security teams reinforced protocols, ensuring no internal leaks could amplify the already volatile situation. The palace was operating at full capacity, knowing that time was a critical factor. But amidst the professional urgency, William had to manage the emotional toll. Watching his brother and sister-in-law wield influence with precision, crafting narratives that could subtly critique or undermine the family, was a personal challenge. He felt a mix of anger, disappointment, and a sense of responsibility heavier than ever before. This was more than a crisis of image. It was a crisis of trust, loyalty, and familial integrity. As days passed, the palace's scramble intensified. The advisors worked in shifts, reviewing every scene, anticipating every public reaction, and preparing responses for international media. Hypothetical scenarios were debated with intensity. What if a scene was interpreted as undermining royal authority? What if anecdotes were taken out of context to suggest dysfunction within the family? Each potential outcome required a unique approach, and every contingency plan had to be synchronized with both legal and communication teams. William also recognized the subtle genius in Meghan's orchestration of Cookie Queens. The documentary was carefully calibrated to appear innocent while embedding layers of influence. Each segment was structured to elicit empathy, highlight challenges, and position Harry and Meghan as relatable yet heroic figures. On the surface, audiences would see cookies, teamwork, and childhood growth. But beneath the cheerful facade, strategic messaging about family dynamics, leadership, and personal agency was interwoven, an almost imperceptible but powerful commentary on the royal family. The emotional intensity in the palace corridors mirrored the strategic urgency. Whispers of betrayal and incredulity circulated among staff. Advisors and aides, usually reserved, expressed concern and disbelief at the audacity of the Sussexes' plan. The combination of family loyalty, public responsibility, and strategic threat created a charged atmosphere. Every conversation carried weight, every decision mattered, and the margin for error was razor-thin. Amid the chaos, William began to formulate a plan of action. He knew that confrontation, if mishandled, could escalate the crisis. Silence could allow the narrative to take root. The challenge was finding a middle path, assertive enough to protect the family and monarchy, discreet enough to avoid unnecessary scandal, and calculated enough to preempt future risks. It was a delicate balancing act that required precision, strategy, and emotional discipline. The palace scramble was not just about preparation, it was also about anticipation. William needed to predict Harry and Meghan's next moves, understand how the narrative could evolve, and preempt potential media interpretations. Every consultant, every analyst, and every advisor contributed to a strategy that would protect both the family and the monarchy. And yet, William knew that no plan, no matter how thorough, could account for human unpredictability. As the hours stretched into days, one thing became clear. The Cookie Queens project was no longer a harmless documentary. It was a catalyst, a trigger for potential familial conflict, media scrutiny, and public perception challenges. The palace had to respond, and it had to do so swiftly, decisively, and with extraordinary care. The stakes were monumental, not just for the present, but for the future of the royal family and its legacy. But as the palace scrambled to contain the storm, William realized something chilling. This was only the beginning. Harry and Meghan's ambitions were deeper than anyone had imagined, and the unfolding saga would test loyalty, trust, and family bonds in ways that no one could predict. The first leak hit like a thunderclap. One carefully selected snippet from Cookie Queens, seemingly trivial, a lighthearted discussion about teamwork during Girl Scout cookie season, was released to a prominent media outlet. The public saw only smiles, camaraderie, and cheerful storytelling. But the palace immediately recognized the undertone. The scene subtly mirrored past family conflicts, presenting personal anecdotes in a way that could be interpreted as commentary on royal leadership. For William, the moment was electrifying, alarming, and infuriating all at once. Within hours, social media exploded. Hashtags trended worldwide. Fans and critics dissected every frame, and pundits speculated about hidden meanings. Commentators praised the Sussexes for honesty, creativity, and relatability, while others hinted at a veiled critique of the royal family. The leak was small, almost innocuous, but its ripple effects were enormous. It had done precisely what William feared. It had reframed public perception in a subtle but powerful way. William convened an emergency strategy session. The room was tense, the air thick with anxiety. Legal advisors, communications experts, and senior aides pored over the leaked footage, analyzing the scene frame by frame. "It's harmless on the surface," one legal expert noted, "but contextually, it could be damaging. The public might see parallels the Sussexes never explicitly mention." Another added, "Once the narrative takes hold, it's almost impossible to control. We need to act, and fast." The palace scrambled to contain the fallout. Communications teams drafted statements designed to clarify context without drawing attention to the leak itself. Press officers were deployed to monitor international media coverage, social media platforms, and influencer commentary. Every possible misinterpretation had to be anticipated. The pressure was relentless. And all the while, the leak fueled speculation. What exactly were Harry and Meghan implying? Were they subtly criticizing the monarchy? Were they rewriting history? The public demanded answers, and the palace had few safe avenues to respond without escalating the situation. William's frustration was compounded by the knowledge that the leak was almost certainly deliberate. Cookie Queens had been crafted with strategic precision. Every anecdote, every frame, every scene was designed to resonate emotionally while subtly shaping narrative. And now, one snippet had reached the public, enough to ignite curiosity, suspicion, and debate. It was an orchestrated move, a testing ground for public reaction, and William felt a surge of anger at the audacity. The emotional impact was as profound as the strategic one. Watching his brother and sister-in-law manipulate public perception, even subtly, felt like a personal betrayal. This was family, someone he had trusted implicitly, someone he had protected, someone he had defended through years of scrutiny and media pressure. And now, Harry was leveraging storytelling in a way that could destabilize the very institution they were born into. William's anger was tempered by the need for strategic discipline, but the personal sting was undeniable. As the palace worked frantically to respond, more details of Cookie Queens emerged. Insider leaks to media outlets suggested that the documentary would include personal reflections on childhood, leadership challenges, and anecdotes that could be interpreted as subtle commentary on royal responsibilities. The narrative framing presented Harry and Meghan as relatable, empathetic, and modern, while implicitly positioning the royal family as traditional, rigid, and sometimes disconnected from public sentiment. The framing was masterful, and the potential impact on public perception was immense. Advisors debated next steps. Some urged immediate legal action to block further leaks. Others advocated for a cautious approach, waiting to assess public reaction before responding. William, balancing strategic necessity with personal emotion, weighed every option. Acting too aggressively could draw more attention to the leaks. Acting too passively risked allowing the Sussexes' narrative to gain traction. The stakes were unprecedented. This was more than a media challenge. It was a potential reshaping of the monarchy's image on the global stage. Meanwhile, public reaction grew more intense. Social media algorithms amplified every post, opinion piece, and meme related to the leaked footage. Fans praised Harry and Meghan for honesty and courage, framing them as champions of transparency and creativity. Critics accused them of subtle manipulation, questioning their motives and loyalty. The public was engaged, polarized, and intensely curious. The narrative was no longer confined to the documentary. It had spilled into headlines, trending topics, and daily conversation worldwide. Within the palace, tension escalated. Advisors warned that each day of silence allowed the Sussexes' framing to take root. Legal counsel emphasized the complexity of media law and potential privacy violations. Communications teams stressed the importance of proactive messaging without drawing undue attention. Security and information officers monitored for further leaks, understanding that controlling the narrative required vigilance at every level. William's role became central. He had to guide the family's response, manage internal dynamics, and safeguard the monarchy's legacy, all under intense public scrutiny. The leaks also revealed the depth of Meghan's influence. Her media acumen and strategic vision were evident in every scene, anecdote, and line of dialogue. It wasn't just storytelling, it was narrative engineering. She had anticipated reactions, designed segments to elicit empathy, and structured the documentary to subtly shape